The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
So joining us from the great Wild West, Wyoming, we've got Ron Franscell. How you doing, Ron?
I'm doing great, Al. Nice to see you, Julie, or, you know,
I know what you mean.
Metaphorically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good.
You haven't been sending my pictures out again, Al, have you?
Yeah. I do every
I promise
chance
I haven't
get.
looked.
So now you've written a new book, Alice and Gerald.
Yes, I have.
It's a homicide love story.
Al. Yes,
Sounds kind of fun.
You know, in some ways it is. The homicidal love story. I've been getting comments about that subtitle as if, you know, we made it up to just tickle the fancy of true crime readers, but it really is a homicidal love story. I'm just getting back from the first leg of my book tour to launch this book, and I found myself describing it to audiences as boy meets girl, boy marries girl, boy and girl kill people, and live happily ever after. It's as funny as it sounds, as incredible as it sounds. That, in fact, is what happens. This is a book about a couple who, separately and together, murdered at least 4 people, probably 5, as the book reveals, and then live happily ever after. It's an amazing story in that sense. It's an amazing story in the sense of the pursuit of these people, and some really interesting characters. So we'll talk about that, I'm sure.
So what drew you into this case? Like, how did you first become aware of it, and what made you write about it? Like, enough to write about it, I guess I should say.
Yeah, well, let me start this way. Let me say that the secret of my success as a writer is that I never pick a story that I can screw up. And Alice and Gerald struck me as such a story. I saw this very human story with a very human crime story. That's what makes this interesting. But it has these universal themes like love and persistence and devotion, which is unusual in true crimes, particularly these days. I saw this by watching social media. I'm a native of Wyoming, now living in Texas. But I have a lot of friends in social media, and they started to talk about this a few years ago when some turns in the case happened, and then I started watching it in the media. Now, you mentioned morgue. I was working on that book at the time, so I set this story aside, and I ultimately came back to it. I think it was first the cast of characters. These are quirky people, to say the least. This homicidal husband and wife, but there's a series of detectives who chase these ghosts over about 40 years, and there's this grandmother who just simply won't let the memories of her daughter and grandsons die. So on one level, it's this American crime story, and on the other, it's sort of a Shakespearean tragedy.
So this went on actually back in the 70s and up to 1980. So this isn't this was what you might call a cold case in a sense. It isn't something that happened recently, other than them getting caught.
Right, and not a cold case in a sense. This is actually a cold case that warms up occasionally, goes cold again, warms up, and goes cold. If not for that grandmother that I mentioned, it would have died a long, long time ago. We wouldn't know who did what to whom, but she kept it alive. She and this succession of detectives. But there are several times when this case literally dies on the vine, and there's nobody there to champion the victims any longer. And again, if not for this grandmother, who's really the moral center of this story, it's not usual that a modern true crime writer would talk about moral centers, but I wanted this to be something other than the ordinary sort of supermarket true crime. And so when I see stories that kind of have those deeper qualities, and that give me a chance to write, kind of make literature of it, then I'm really intrigued. And like I say, Alice and Gerald fit this profile. I saw this tale of murder, but I saw a chance to write about a time and a place that I knew like the back of my hand. The Shakespearean part appealed to me. I think it reflected the dark side of a lot of people, not just this husband and wife, but it also reflected this kind of goodness and common faith of a few others. So it was deep, but it was a simple choice.
Now, with the couple themselves, that's kind of an unusual thing, to kill kind of basically your exes and children as well, to pursue a new relationship, and yet nothing else really happened since that, and that was a long time ago.
Yes. And going back even before that, we see Alice as this kind of unrooted single mom, connecting with all kinds of guys and occasional husbands. She has 3 husbands, so she's a kind of hard case that kills one of those husbands and disposes of him in such a way that he'll never be found. At least she believes. And then moves on, where she meets Gerald, and they connect. In Alice, we have this narcissistic sociopath. Again, I hate to keep going back to this, but she's Lady Macbeth. She's ambitious, she's cold-blooded, she wants what she wants at any cost. And she has a husband who will do anything for her, including murder. So there was that element to it. These two sort of gritty, dog-eared people that, rose in my mind anyway to Lady Macbeth and her husband. Gerald was that kind of doofus farm boy who also married and divorced 3 times, and was determined that he wasn't going to lose number 4, and that was Alice. So he became sort of perversely devoted to her, so that at a point when she decides that his ex-wife really shouldn't be on the scene anymore, and she tells Gerald this, you don't fix this, I'm gone. Well, now here's this guy who doesn't want to lose number 4, and in that we have we've had murders before, remember, of Alice's, but now we have an ex-wife and 2 boys that, incredibly, he's all too eager to get rid of.
Ron, may I ask a question? I just
Sure.
obviously this is something that you're really used to doing, writing about crimes. But in terms of as you've said, the setting the scene, setting the stage, all of these absolutely fascinating characters who you relate to in Shakespearean terms, what research did you have to do to understand them?
A lot. Not so much the place, because I lived that. I was a teenager in the Wild West of Wyoming. At the time these crimes were happening, of course, unknown to anyone. In the summers, I worked in construction jobs and in the oil fields, and I bumped up against these kinds of people. I knew the place. There's a trailer park theme that runs through this. So I knew that landscape, and I knew the mindscape intimately. That was something for me that was important. For you, what's important is that I'm an old school journalist. I believe as deeply as possible in being there, having my boots on the ground. So I went to these places. I stood in the spots where women and boys died. I stood in the spots where things happened that are, unsavory. Most of all, I look for that kind of narrative dust that settles on everything. I think it's that grit that makes it real, and I'm looking for it. And then after that, it's just a matter of all the practice and taking risks that I think a worthy writer does. And I'll say this too. I subscribe to this kind of iceberg theory, and it you might only see 10% of what I'd like to tell you, but the book has its limitations. So I'm trying to make you understand that there's 90% below the surface, and that's what makes it real. In this case, I did more than 150 interviews. I had unprecedented access to all the 40 years of investigative reports, the transcripts, recordings of all kinds. And for the past 4 years, I've had a correspondence with Gerald, whom I've also met and interviewed. So I just believe it's the research that shines through on a story like this.
And in terms of the profiling of the behaviours, the criminal behaviours, or what led somebody, what rage, what lack of empathy led people to undertake the crimes that they committed, how did you go about that? How did you understand those behaviours?
Well, first, in this was my 17th book. I've certainly rubbed up against the criminal mind a few times, and so I had a basic layman's understanding of that. But there was a forensic psychologist who worked on this case years ago, and I reached out to him, and he taught me many more things, particularly about Alice and Gerald and their psychopathy. And it really kind of boils down to that, to Alice's narcissism and she's a narcissistic sociopath. And she loves nobody but herself. Which kind of belies the homicidal love story subtitle. But she is in love. It's just with herself. Mm. And the narcissistic sociopath has a few odd little things that they do, and she did them. Clearly, you see them at work. Gerald, on the other hand, I think we show in the book, I don't know who we is, I wrote the book, but I think I show in the book that Gerald is a kind of created sociopath, that out of his compulsion to keep Alice, he will do anything. And so, and even murder, and even the murder of people who slept with him, who told him that they loved him, called him daddy. That takes a special kind of mentality. He is a sociopath, but of a different sort than Alice. And I think a lot of it has to do with that absolute need to keep her, and for which he would do anything.
And you've just described to us some of the jobs that you did prior to journalism and then being a crime writer. What would you have done had you not have gone into journalism? Because clearly your interest in why people do the things that they do and how you make that story shines through with this passion and just the way you... Go on, sorry.
No, I think it's a great question. I don't know what I would have done without journalism. I think it's the journalism that underlies all of this. What I do is something called narrative nonfiction. I didn't invent it. I only use that style. It really kind of starts with Truman Capote and In Cold Blood. Of course, he was pioneering it, so he was making some errors as he experimented with it. And I am aware of those errors, but I like the idea that you can tell a completely true story that where I use tools from the novelist's toolbox. Instead of a newspaper story told in fairly unpassionate terms, in a kind of weird structure, I'm telling a story. It's completely true, but I'm using dialogue and foreshadowing and dramatic moments and characters, not sources.
It's looking at the motive and the behaviours and the emotions that lie beneath each person involved in just telling the storyline, what happened and when.
Yes, and absolutely, and in addition to that, seeing them as characters, not just somebody to say, well, and then he went here, and then he went there, and then he said this. I'm trying to understand their motivations. I'm trying to paint them the way the way you would see a character in a novel, except that I'm doing it with absolute authenticity. And those are the kinds of stories that I'm always on the lookout for. And like I said, Alice and Gerald fit that profile. It's just a vivid story, a gritty story that doesn't follow the usual predictable beats of modern true crime writing. It offered me this chance to write what humans are capable of, both good and bad. That's just the kind of story I like. If I'm going to spend a year or two of my life immersed in all that gore and that mayhem, at least I want to see some purpose to it. I want to see blue sky. I get so close to these particular flames, I just want to make it worth the risk.
I work in a field where I work with people, and my main goal, I suppose, is to understand why people do what they do and how and what motivates them, so that I can help them to make changes. And I suppose listening to you talk about those characters and understanding them, when you're going through any research, you're thinking all the time of different hypotheses, and you're kind of testing them out. Does this work? Does it not work? Is that the motivation? What tells me that? What evidence do I have to almost dismiss that hypothesis or agree with it and validate it? So was there ever a time during your research where you came across information that maybe the police had missed or they weren't aware of that you fed back? And I suppose this question goes to any of your books and the research that you've done?
Yes, I think so. I mean, police are looking for certain things and certain clues that are along the line that of enforcing the law. Now they stray a little bit, of course, on either side, and they don't know what's going to come in. But once they get on that scent, then they go, and there's more focus to it. In this particular case, we had a woman who killed her third husband, then went on, of course, to be more than an inspiration, maybe a conspirator, well, definitely a conspirator in a murder of 3 other people. Along the way, it became apparent to me that her second husband had died very young, supposedly from the effects of alcoholism. The more we explored what really happened there, the more questions arose. Ultimately, that man was exhumed, and there wasn't enough information to declare it a homicide, but based on his medical records, the medical examiner declared it an undetermined death, likely homicide. So that's something where, you know, the investigation has pursued a one line, and somebody comes along and says, well, what about this other line? And they swing into action very quickly, but they just get focused on getting justice for people. And frankly, it's the investigators in this book that are also fascinating to me. There's about 6 of them, men and women, who are chasing this case. And I'm telling you, they for reasons that humans occasionally run into, they had to leave the case behind. But then along comes somebody else to pick it up and move it down the field just a little farther. So for 40 years that goes on, and to capture their passion for the case and what they did wrong and what they did right. I think you look at it honestly, but these are human beings. They miss things.
And that's pretty interesting in the sense that now Alice went through 3 husbands, killed 1, maybe 2.
Yes.
What made her stay so long with Gerald? Like, what was the difference in staying with him? Like, it just seems like a total change.
Purely that she now had a henchman, although she'd never refer to him that way. She now had a henchman, a guy who would do absolutely anything for her, up to and including murder. And you know, who doesn't? What sociopath doesn't want that? Here was this guy that was under her control completely, and I think that's what the difference was. The others had things that she wanted, or they were humans that she didn't want, and so she took care of it. I once asked Gerald, did you go to sleep every night? He knew about the earlier murders. I said, do you go to sleep every night with one eye open? And he just looked at me like I had come up with the dumbest question ever. And he said, no, we love each other. Neither of us would do anything to the other. We're in love. I interviewed Alice, and I didn't. she would have said something. She would have said, no, she never suspected Gerald of wanting to kill her in the night, and so she didn't go to bed with one eye open either. But and I did not interview Alice, by the way, because she refused. And if you think about that, a controlling personality, that's the only control she has, is to tell somebody who wants something from her, no. And if she had given an interview, she couldn't control what comes out at the other end. She couldn't control the questions. She couldn't even really control her story. So the most control she has is telling me no. And it's total control.
Now, Alice and Gerald ended up having a child, didn't they?
No, they never did together. But Alice had 5 children before she met Gerald. One of them was a toddler when they met. So the two of them never had children, but in various forms, they raised Alice's children that she had earlier.
Wow. How did the children deal with this when it came out?
Remember when I told you that every narcissistic sociopath does certain things that mark them? One of the things, of many, is that they have to tell somebody. This is the narcissist part. They have to tell somebody. You need to know what they can do and how smart they are and what they have done. After Alice murdered her 3rd husband, she moves to another town in Wyoming and takes a job as a barmaid in a roadhouse. It's about 30 miles away from any civilization. She has a 12-year-old son and the toddler that I mentioned. The 12-year-old son, this 7th grader, his job was to drive her out into the middle of nowhere to this roadhouse to sit in the parking lot while she worked her shift, and then at the end of her shift, she would usually bring a 6-pack of beer, and they would head back to town. Along the way, they would share this 6-pack of beer. Again, a 12-year-old boy driving the car at 2 or 3 in the morning, drinking beer with his mother. At one point, he says something like, "Mom, as a parent, you suck." Alice's response is to tell him how she has killed this husband. Now, this isn't a distraught mother unburdening herself of a terrible memory, a terrible secret. This is a mother firing a shot across the bow of a 12-year-old boy who thinks she sucks as a mother. So the message he takes away is, shut the hell up or I'll kill you too. So how does he deal with that? Well, this is a long time ago. This is in the 70s. He grows up. And it's he who he doesn't have any details. He doesn't know what police need to know. But he has that general story that his mother has killed somebody. And when the burden of carrying that around gets too great, he seeks out a cop and says, "My mother once told me this story." And at that point, the investigation takes a strange turn. So, how do her kids feel about it? Not good. She has no relationship with 4 of the 5. The 5th, the youngest, is kind of a double agent for the cops and for the parents, and she's reporting back and forth on all of them. She's giving cops information. She's checking on things for her mother. It's a very strange, complex thing that's going on there. But I, in general, to answer your question, 4 of those kids have no contact with her. They kind of see her for what she is. the fifth sees her for what she is, but sees for herself how she might get something from that. So it's very complicated.
Sounds like it. And so what's the relationship like now with Gerald and Alice themselves? I mean, they're both in prison, but are they still together as a couple mentally anyway?
Maybe mentally. Gerald is in a medium security men's prison in Wyoming. Alice was initially sent to a women's prison, but they're both in their upper 70s. Alice has a few ailments, so ultimately she was sent to the geriatric facility of the prison system, which happens to be in the same prison where Gerald is incarcerated. Every night they lay their heads down on their pillows, maybe 20 yards apart, separated by a few concrete walls, of course. They will never see each other again. They can write to one another, but they can't speak on the phone. Obviously, can't see each other. They can't visit in some ways because the law says one felon can't hang around with another felon. So, in a sort of perverse sense, they've been reduced to that. But in many ways, that's the punishment that Gerald hates the worst in this, that he can't see Alice. And it's interesting. Once again, we're going back to that love story. He's absolutely devoted. While I didn't talk to Alice, I would suspect that she's okay with it. She's the one she cares about, not him. If he does share a pension that he had from the mine where he worked for many years, and he shares that money with her so she can have money in the commissary and that sort of thing. But really, that's the extent of their relationship now.
So, are there regrets, Ron? I mean, do we know that they express regret about any of their actions?
Again, I don't know. In Alice's case, I would doubt it. No remorse. For a sociopath such as she is, there is no remorse. They can't feel it. In Gerald's case, I've asked him that very question. Do you regret anything about this? He regrets being caught. He speaks kind of sheepishly about the actual crime, but he doesn't express any serious remorse that he did it, and that's a reflection of the sociopath he's become. Is that he regrets being caught. He also regrets not seeing Alice, but that's about the extent of it. No, not anything approaching remorse or regret for their victims.
Well, he actually killed two of his children, didn't he, or stepchildren? Yes,
indeed. Adopted sons. His ex-wife had two boys that he adopted and raised, and at least for a bit of their childhood. They called him Daddy. He loved that. Gerald was obsessed with having a wife, having a lover, and having a family. And along comes Virginia, and she has the family. And so it's ready-made, and it's part of her attraction. Ultimately, their relationship goes sour, but very, very quickly along comes Alice, and she too has a family. So that's part of his attraction to her, is that the family he always wanted is ready-made. It's right there. He sees himself as a John Wayne type character. He sees himself as this cunning, powerful, protective man, John Wayne. He's none of those things. He's none of those things. He's kind of a Nebraska farm boy without many book smarts, without many street smarts. He's kind of a doofus. But his self-image required him to have a family to protect. And here they were. So, he's a complicated character, even being a doofus. He's very complicated. In our conversations, he's like your strange uncle who tells jokes that aren't that funny, but he keeps telling them. You might even tell them twice. He would sing me a cappella. He would sing me songs. He did play a guitar, but he just couldn't have one in prison. He would sing songs, usually Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, the Outlaws. So he would recite poetry badly. He would talk about his Navy days and people he knew back in Nebraska. All those things that your strange uncle says at Thanksgiving. But when I would talk to him about his crimes, this kind of veil came down, and he was very distant, very cold, very matter-of-fact about it, and they are grotesque. But that
what do they think of the book? What do they think of the book, Ron? What do they think about you writing this book? What do you think that gives them?
I think in Gerald's case, it took a while to convince him to participate in this. Of course, Alice never did. And the best selling point I could offer is that he gets to tell his story. If he doesn't tell it, then the prosecutors, the cops, the people who didn't like him at work, the disgruntled neighbors, they're going to tell your story. So I would like to hear it from you. And that became a very powerful thing for him. He knew I was writing a book. He was open. I have dozens of letters from him. I have 3 personal interviews with him. I think he was candid, at least with the stories that he was going to tell me. I don't know if they were true, and in fact, in a lot of ways, I don't think they were true. But who's been a bigger, who's been made more angry by this is that youngest daughter, who saw the opportunity to make money by selling her life rights to Hollywood and maybe getting a movie made about this little girl who's raised by killers, So I sort of jumped her line and wrote this book before she did. And I'm told that makes her very angry. By Gerald. Gerald's the one that tells me that she's very angry about me doing that. So I think that's more than Gerald.
Have they had the opportunity to read the final book that you know of?
First of all, no. First of all, I never share my work with anybody before it's published. And it's just a journalism ethic. Unless I'm writing about nuclear physics and I'm likely to get it wrong, I might show that to a physicist, that section to a physicist, and say, tell me where I'm wrong. Yeah. But no, first of all, I never show my work to anybody, particularly sources, before it's published. In this particular case, they won't ever read the book because a true crime book can't get into the prison.
Right.
I'm actually honored that my earliest true crime, The Darkest Night, is banned by the Texas Department of Corrections. So it seems like it's not enough to just intercept the book, but they actually put it on a list. So, but no, they'll never read it. They'll get summaries from the daughter, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Wow, that's quite a story. Now, did you think that they were involved in any other murders in the last 40 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've certainly talked to the investigators. There's the one that we talked about earlier, the fellow who was exhumed. Alice is such the sociopathy of Alice is such that it's hard to believe that she didn't do it to somebody else. So Alice was what's the right word? I'll just say doable. And she had a number of what I'll call drive-by romances. You know, they were very short and torrid, and there's a number of them. She ultimately gets fired from that bar, that roadhouse in the middle of nowhere, because she's having sex with the I don't mean one or two, but the whole railroad crews that would stop there. And pretty soon, when they'd get drunk, you know, there was invariably a fight between the guy she was sleeping with now and the guy she was sleeping with yesterday. And so she got fired. So that being the case, it's hard to imagine that Alice didn't maybe avail herself of murder when somebody did something she didn't like or she had no use for them. There is no evidence of that. This is just a deduction based on knowing that kind of a criminal mind.
Now, I was going to say, they never did find Gerald's ex-wife and 2 kids, or did they?
No, they never have.
So wouldn't that be difficult to prove then without the bodies?
That's part of the problem here. For 40 years, Gerald was always a person of interest, but without a body, without a murder weapon, without a confession, there was no way they were going to get into court with this case, particularly if they took it, you know, at its weakest form and he got acquitted. Because then he could walk out of that courtroom and say, you know, I did it. I killed them all. I slaughtered them. There's not a damn thing they could do then. So the double jeopardy that was always on their mind, that they needed a more watertight case than they had. And that just never happened. They have never found his victims, and that's part of the tragedy. And when I talk about this grandmother, she was the mother of the woman, the ex-wife, and the grandmother of these 2 little boys, and they were the only people in the world in her family. And she kept that alive. She was spending every dime that she had left over after buying food for herself on this search. Before the internet, you know, this is making tens of thousands of Xerox copies and tacking them to telephone poles and writing letters to people who might know something. For 40 years, she did this, and it's amazing. When you see in the book the things that she did, it is just amazing. So, she is, as I said, she's the moral center. She never loses hope. And honestly, that's a rare thing in modern true crime. Altogether, all these people, Alice and Gerald and the investigators, the grandmother, they're real life symbols of evil, of good, of devotion. And like I said, they add up to a bigger story than just a simple murder investigation, and that's what attracts me.
Wow, what a great story. How about giving out your contact information? You have a website, and of course the book is available everywhere. We'll have that up on our site as well, so people can do one click and buy the book. What's your website for people?
My website is www.ronfranscell.com, all one word, of course. And the last name is spelled Franscell, just to make it tricky.
Of course. So what do you got coming up next? I guess you haven't even.
I'm working on another story that kind of fits this same feel, cut from the same cloth, and again, it comes roughly from this same time and this same place, the Upper Rockies in the West, and it's a fascinating case about a serial killer in a small town who, against the odds, is never recognized, is never suspected. They're not even sure that these deaths are murders. At any rate, when suspicion starts to percolate up, the FBI gets involved, and the whole way that we look for criminals, the whole of criminology changes based on what they do. So it's historic. It's a historic case about somebody you've never heard of.
Wow!
If you can believe that.
Sounds great.
I hope so.
Yeah, well, you always do good books. Our guest has been Ron Franscell, and the book is Alice and Gerald, and it's a homicidal love story. Thank you for taking the time to talk about your book.
I was privileged to be with you and Julie and your listeners. I appreciate you having me.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.